Good afternoon, everyone. This is Megan with Aperture Education. Welcome to the SEL and Resilience, a holistic approach to preventative mental health webinar. We're so glad that you're joining us today. Just a few things as we're all entering. The first of which is that we are recording this session. So if you are not able to join us live, or if you have to leave early or experience some technical issues, know that we are recording. Let me just make sure that that is happening right now. Perfect, it is. So we will also be sending that recording out to everyone at the end of the webinar. You'll be getting an email from me probably tomorrow morning with additional resources, the slide deck, and the recording of the webinar. If for some reason you cannot see the slide deck, you should be seeing on your screen. It has a little schoolhouse and it has the title of our webinar and our logo. You might have to click on the tiny box that's at the top of your Zoom screen. If you double click on that box, it should open up those slides for you in a larger screen. If you're still having any issues, please let me know. You can put something in the chat box. You can also ask a question, or you can raise your hand and I will take care of any technical issues that you may be having. I wanted to let you know that we do have a few features if you've never used a Zoom webinar before. One of those is the chat feature, and that's just a little place where everyone, including the panelists and everyone who's in attendance, can see anything that you write. So if you want to go ahead and find that little chat box at the bottom of your screen and type in your name, your school, and where you're from today, so we can get a little bit of an understanding of who's with us. You'll also see that there is a place for questions and answers. And if you have a question for any of the presenters, please go ahead and put it in that Q&A section. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll try to take a few minutes to answer some of those frequently asked questions. If for some reason your question is not answered during the webinar today, if you put it in that Q&A section, we will be able to see it after the webinar and we'll be able to reach out to you individually. Also, we will be sending out a few additional resources, including our Vulnerable Children white paper, which some of you may have gotten a few weeks ago in an email. We also have our back to school guide and anything else that may be of importance as we go through this presentation today. So we'll go ahead and introduce our panelists. First, we have Lisa Ann Williams and Kim Williams, who are not related, but we call them our Williams sisters, part of the Aperture Education team. Lisa Ann is one of our partnership managers and a master trainer. She's a former special education teacher with over 13 years of experience in special needs, emotional disabilities, conduct disorders, behavior management, social skills training, curriculum and instruction, and delivery and crisis prevention interventions. Kim Williams is a client success specialist and our professional development lead. She's been in the field of social and emotional learning since 2001. Her educational skills and experience have translated into a variety of settings, including schools, nonprofits, universities, and statewide organizations. Next, we have Brian Clement from Dovetail Learning. Brian directs comprehensive partnerships for school-based SEL implementation and works with districts, schools, and community-based organizations all over the country. He has over 15 years of experience in education as a teacher and a K-8 principal, and he has personally worked with over 200 schools in his time at Dovetail Learning. In addition to working at Dovetail, he's an ACE interface presenter with the County of Sonoma in California. We also have Dr. Gina Hurley from Barnstable Public Schools in Massachusetts. Dr. Hurley began her career as a school psychologist. She received her master's and CAGS from UMass Boston and her doctorate of education from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. She's currently the executive director of SEL and student services for Barnstable Public Schools. She's responsible for district-wide social emotional curriculum and assessment and student services. Dr. Hurley is a past president of the Massachusetts School Psychology Association, is an adjunct faculty member, and volunteers with Big Brothers and Big Sisters. Lastly, we have Katherine Thompson and Sherry Chapman from Middletown Public Schools in Connecticut. Sherry is currently the social and emotional learning coordinator at 2 elementary schools in Middletown, Connecticut. Over the last 2 school years, she has been working collaboratively with district leaders to create a system of development for Middletown Public Schools' innovative social emotional learning and intervention framework, referred to as SEL. Katherine Thompson is currently the project manager of a mental health grant in Middletown Public Schools, funded by the Federal Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration and the Connecticut State Department of Education. Goals of the Project Aware grant, which is the Advancing Wellness and Resilience in Education, include increasing awareness of mental health issues of school-aged youth, training educators and other youth-serving adults to detect and respond to mental health issues, and connecting youth and families to services. So we'll go ahead and begin our presentation with Lisa Ann Williams. So Lisa Ann, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Megan. As we get started here, I know that there are lots of different components in the way that districts really look at SEL and how it fits in. And I'm just really jump in there with thinking about an educator, and I'm happy to share and hope that you can find some of these tips useful and something that can be put in place, you know, the next time you're in a classroom, whether that's as a teacher, as a educating support personnel, or in any other ways that you're supporting the needs of students. So looking at developing your SEL class, you know, all of these areas can begin on day one, but some educators may more easily start with one over another. I'll touch on classroom routines first, just because that's something that always grounded me and was something I could go back to and easily review and revise. So we really begin with teacher model classroom routines. It's really important to have that positive model of what something looks like and that clear outline steps in the routine. And so it's easy to start there and then move to looking at peer modeled examples, and then lessening that support to just including visual supports around the room. But of course, you know, that then lessens even further to just providing verbal cues as reminders for students to correctly use the routines. Now, there's going to be students who will always need a higher level of support when it comes to having a clear list of what these routines are and what the steps are to be included. And so there's lots of great ways to individualize, you know, those visual supports for students in a room, or also, you know, at their personal workspace. So one thing that, you know, is really helpful is just to teach and reteach. You know, if behaviors are moving away from what that expected demonstration is, just to get back to the more supportive model. So if you have to go back to modeling it as the educator to get everybody back on track, then that's what you do. So anytime we really see everybody falling out of line, bring it back. And there's lots of daily opportunities to focus on skills, you know, such as being able to say nice things about peers, or looking forward to a class or activity for the day, or positive events in the future. Being able to, you know, have high expectations about themselves, and, you know, all of these skills build optimistic thinking and have a really great impact on resilience. And that does come from a lot of the research out there that's on resiliency theory. Some of the areas to think of to integrate these are like welcome routines, whether that's welcoming students at the door, having a student greeter, your morning meetings, circle time, looking at your daily schedule ahead. And so that educators naturally look at their daily routines and can pick these out. You know, another great thing to really include in those classroom routines, everybody gets to be a leader. Everybody gets a chance to practice being a leader. Everyone gets a chance to be a leader in an area that they already know how to do, whether it's something very small or something larger. And that idea that leadership skills grow through practice helps all children really find where they're already comfortable and build and scaffold to where they can grow and become stronger. Try to keep everything simple and developmental. All these skills that we're thinking about, students usually can start to learn and understand more about the skills that relate to themselves, before they're really able to apply them to complex situations. So, you know, you think about that egotistical child and how the whole world revolves around them, then it's definitely easy for them to understand a lot of these skills about themselves first. Looking at standards integration, you know, within language arts instruction, you know, reading, writing, listening, and speaking are all addressed across grade levels, and honestly I found was the easiest place to start. So there's lots of different activities, but most standards and classrooms include read alouds, guided reading, and independent reading. So, you know, in the beginning of those kinds of activities, students, you know, give opinions when they're asked to make predictions. They practice showing respect to the opinions of others. They practice paying attention as they listen to the story. They take an active role in learning. They wait for their turn, ask questions to clarify, seek out additional knowledge and information. And then, you know, at the end, in a lot of the comprehension wrap-ups within these kinds of activities, students are able to connect to characters and events, and overall see the relationship between that story and other texts, and also think about their own life while contributing to that group effort of understanding and comprehending what they've listened or read. You know, they often can describe how they're feeling in response to a connection with the character, and they have an opportunity to make statements, accurate statements about their life as related to the text. You know, these are all kind of skills that fall into that self-awareness and self-management, but also social awareness and goal-directed behavior. You know, math and science definitely lend themselves to problem-solving processes and collaboration, and there's a lot of other areas that you can get into there. So with expectations, we really, you know, want to think about what's the most important thing you can think of to expect in a classroom, and that's really the kind of language that everybody uses with each other. And so pulling in optimistic thinking there again, focusing on the positive, taking problem-solving approaches to challenges, setting goals and making steps for the goals. And those can be class goals, academic goals, habit-forming goals, classroom community building goals, all of those. Always acknowledging your strengths and areas of growth, both as, you know, an individual and a community, and the expectation that there's always time to practice something correctly, that there is time given to stop and think and say, you know what, we can do this the right way, and we don't have to rush through and just choose the quickest thing possible to get to the end. And then finally, teacher-modeled SEL. You know, educators need to be honest and let children see us, like face our challenges, you know, while staying calm and working through problem-solving processes, and watch us reflect on events and see how we look at, you know, what options we might have had to change that approach the next time. We can model how to make requests in a polite way. We can model how to express concern for others, whether it's our other educators and teachers that we work with and they see us interacting with, but whether it's the students in our class and in the school. You know, and we continue to show how to, you know, forgive actions that maybe upset us, and really help children expand their vocabulary as we can identify a lot larger range of emotions and what, you know, the context of use of that vocabulary can be used in. And so finally, you know, every educator teaches SEL. We don't always know right away what the depth of our lens is, but there's lots of ways to continue to catch the teachable moments and develop that SEL lens. And back to you, Megan.
Great, thank you, Lisa Ann. Our next portion of the presentation is Gina Hurley from Barnstable Public Schools. So we'll go ahead and let Gina go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about establishing a culture of data use. In Barnstable, which is on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, there's not a lot of school districts around us who have been using an SEL screener. And so when we decided to use ours or to establish one 4 years ago, we took a year for planning the whole event. And then this would be our third year right now, going into our third year of using an SEL screener. And what we wanted to make sure that we established was, how are we going to use that data? What is our culture of data use? Because you can certainly do an assessment, but if you're not using the data, then you're really spinning your wheels and jumping through a lot of hoops. So we used, we're continuing to use a framework that we got from West Ed, and it contains 5 elements, and you can see them on your screen there. Basically ensuring access to data, and then how do we use that data in a meaningful way. Also clarifying the expectations of data use, and then building knowledge and skills to use that data. And then who are the leaders that's really going to be out front working with our educators on creating and supporting that culture of data use. So those are the 5 elements that I'd like to talk to you a little bit about today. I did put a slide in that you see on your screen now that hopefully you walk away with a couple of ideas in each of these areas, or at least you start thinking about each of these areas. The first one that I think is very important is ensuring access to data. So we use the DESSA. This is our 3rd year of using the DESSA. And when we started, we really wanted to make sure that data was accessible and was prepared in a way that teachers and school counselors could understand, could get to quickly, and that the data actually told them something or answered something about their students. And what we decided to do was give as much and as little as teachers needed to build their capacity over time. We didn't want to saturate teachers with all of the different reports that you can get from the DESSA. So the first year we had teachers look at their classroom data. We have SEED coaches, which stands for Social Emotional Academic Development Coaches, that are in all of our buildings. They're not there full time, although we would love that, but they help facilitate access and the actual universal screening process. And we look at that data twice a year with teachers and DESSA teams. So we started that in year 1. Year 2, we added comparison reports for the teachers as well as the leaders in the building to review. So we were looking at fall data and then looking at spring data and how did our interventions work in between those 2 time frames. And then this year, in regarding access to data, we are going to be providing and teaching teachers how to look at the group profile reports to show individual student profiles over time. So again, we're titrating how much teachers are getting so that they can make some meaningful conclusions with this data, which is element number 2, making meaning from data. In order to do that, you need to have protected time. And we do that in our PLC groups. So there's protected time provided to allow the teachers to look at their data, make sense of the data, and actually explore what the next steps might be, whether it's at the classroom level, at the grade level, or at the school level. So again, in year 1, we had fall and spring DESSA data meetings. So after the window closed, I met with the principal, the SEED coach, the school psychologist, and counselors, and we looked at the data, and then the principals shared that data and discussed that data at faculty meetings. In year 2, we added professional learning community time to be devoted to reviewing data with teachers, in addition to reviewing SEL competency areas and what that looked like in the classroom. And then this year, we're going to continue with the above and add additional group profile reports. So that's element 2. Element 3 is clarifying expectations for data use. So as I said when I started, we really wanted to not just have the data, but set some expectations for that data and what we would do with that data. So setting expectations on how we use the data. We are using the data to identify students who need more of a tier 1 SEL curriculum and or tier 2 intervention. So in the fall, We use the DESSA data to identify those students who need an instructional intervention. And then in the spring, we look at that data to determine how did our interventions go, and whether we need to use that data to help with placement for the following fall. Year 2, in addition to what we did in year 1, we now had, last year we had 4 data points, 2 each year for 2 years. And we're starting to use that data to look at trends at individual school levels. And this year we're going to continue to do the same in order to grow that culture of data use. In element 4, we're really building knowledge and skills to use the data. So we're having professional development that's taking place. We have looked at both in year 1 using the professional development that is provided by DESSA using the DESSA webinars, and we use that at faculty meetings. And that was for both our principals and our staff. And then in year 2, we continued that professional development through the SEED coaches, really providing more consultation, co-teaching, and modeling of our SEL curriculum. And we will continue that again this year, onboarding some new staff members as they come on each year. And then lastly, in element 5, it's really looking at leading a culture of data use. So is there somebody in your district who's doing that? And is there somebody at the building levels that are doing that? And I think that unless you have a commitment by your district, it's really hard to do that. So that's my role. It's part of my role to make sure that we're using the data, and I'm actually working with principals on making sure that not just looking at district data, but looking at building level data to see what steps we need to take. So as you can see there, in year 1, we did professional development. In year 2, we continued that professional development by looking at those trends. And we're actually having this year, our superintendent has asked all the principals to include SEL and SEL data in their school improvement plans. So on the last slide, for my part, you'll just see a lot of what I've already communicated on what schools must do. And I'll leave my portion saying that unless there's a commitment to creating a culture of data use, then you're only using your universal screeners for so far. They're only going to take you so far. There needs to be a commitment to this culture of data use in order to continue to work in the field and advance the field of SEL with our students. And I'll turn it back to Megan.
Thank you so much, Gina. Before we go, we actually had 2 specific questions for Barnstable that I was hoping you could answer. The first answer is if you could tell us what the size of the Barnstable School District is.
Sure. We have 9 schools with 5,300 students.
Great. And the second question, could you just repeat what the SEED acronym stands for?
Sure. Social, Emotional, Academic Development.
Great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
All right. The next section of our presentation will be from Sherry and Kathy from Middletown Public Schools. So I'll go ahead and let them get started.
Thanks, Megan. Hi, everybody. Kathy and I are so excited to be part of this webinar. We're really proud of the work that Middletown Public Schools have been doing over the past year and a half, and we're excited to share it with you. So our question, what are our preventative mental health initiatives? So specifically, we've been in the process of developing our Middletown social and emotional intervention model, which reflects a multi-tiered system of supports that a continuum of evidence-based social, emotional, and behavioral practices that are matched specifically to students' needs. It's a framework for helping school personnel adapt evidence-based interventions to improve academic and social behavioral outcomes for all of our students. The DESSA screener has really allowed for us to early identify students that may need additional supports in developing their SEL competencies. The mini DESSA screener has provided information to drive tiers of SEL intervention at the whole school system level. This also has provided information at the broader level to identify SEL competencies for specific whole class learning and whole school instruction. More specifically, the Universal Screening Assessment, or full DESSA, really has allowed us to measure, provide specific instruction to targeted areas of SEL at the small group and individual student level.
So how does this support building? Hi everybody, this is Katherine Thompson from Middletown. So how do we support our capacity? The mini DESSA Universal Screener informed school leadership of larger gaps in our systemic delivery of social emotional learning instruction. For instance, we realized that we needed building and district level knowledge, tier 1 for social emotional learning. So through this, we developed a district social emotional learning library, which included evidence-based curriculum and materials. We embraced an evidence-based emotional intelligence framework, which provides a common social emotional learning language and to emotional regulation for all of our students. In addition, we trained multiple tiers of our system district-wide in social emotional learning, trauma-informed care, equity, restorative practices, mental health awareness, and multi-tiered systems of supports.
The need for a stronger tier 2 system is evident as the result of our DESSA screening tools. And this is really where our MSEL framework emerged to include really strong administrative leadership and teacher leadership, building-based SEL interventionists, home visitors, and faith-based mentors as part of our team.
I wanted to mention that Middletown does currently have a sizable mental health grant called Project Aware, and that stands for Advancing Wellness and Resilience in Education. It's a 5-year multi-million-dollar grant from the federal SAMHSA and also through the Connecticut State Department of Education. This has really stirred our efforts to get it off the ground relatively quickly from such a multi-tiered systems of supports. But as the grant funding is time limited, sustainability conversations are all the more relevant to this work. That moves us into our next slide. How will we sustain our systems? From the beginning, this systems change. The MSEL framework was written into our strategic operating plan with strong support from multiple stakeholders, including our Board of Education and our superintendent. Funding is also coming from multiple layers of our district budget as well as the grant, so it is not solely funded even at this point in time. The concept that our change is a framework and not a program is paramount to sustainability, because while programs can lose funding and go away, a shift in systemic practice is long lasting. Teacher leaders, so non-administrative, including Sherry and myself, are strong catalysts for change at that ground level because we really know what the practitioners need in real time. We're coming from that work, and it really has supported us with buy-in. But we are also supported significantly by multiple higher levels of our administration. We also have multiple layers of collaboration systemically, including building and district level leadership, bi-monthly professional development led by in-house experts. We utilize train the trainers models of professional, and we also embrace community and family engagement. It allowed us to develop our own innovative version of best practices, which is pretty new. And the collaborative meetings also allow us outlets for creating that excitement and buy-in across our in the community. This is all important to sustainability work well. Our next step in the professional development phase of this process is to continue to utilize the data to measure pre and out of our multi-tiered social emotional learning. The assessment data is critical in the sustainability cell that the MSEL framework is impacting students' social emotional learning. To take it one step further, we're planning to integrate our DESSA and Power School technology systems to take the conversation to the next step by being able to show data-based impact of SEL, social emotional learning intervention on student achievement. So that's the plan anyways. This is what we have from we're looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panel.
Great. Thank you both so much. That was excellent. For the next section of our presentation, we'll be hearing from Brian Clement.
Hey, how are you? So happy to be on this webinar with everyone here, and more specifically, so inspired by the attendees who are doing it all the time with the kiddos themselves. So just a little context framing, just to ensure we're all kind of starting from the same place. The slide that you'll see here is a list of how we're defining adverse childhood experiences, and a little background. Megan, if you want to go to that next slide, is how we're looking at the protective factors within the ACEs framework. And specifically, for those who aren't aware, there was an original study done in the late 90s that started actually as an obesity study. But there are 10 ACEs, and typically we talk about ACEs as a score 0 to 10. Of which you see listed here: emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, the family dysfunction, and then in the neglect itself. So that kind of framed our understanding and awareness that so much of what transpires in childhood actually influences long-term physical and mental health. And the cluster of data about what one experiences in childhood is so correlated to long-term health that it becomes an awareness that we want to build. And currently we talk about an information dissemination campaign about ACEs and the long-term effects. In the next slide, you sort of see a traditional representation of ACEs over a lifetime. And as someone who works with schools and teacher development and awareness in this arena, some of the factors, we start to see ourselves in that, and we forget that we ourselves have experienced various trauma and that we need to be mindful of our own wellness and resilience. But again, some context setting. 1 in 8 people have had 4 or more ACEs. 2 out of 3 people have at least 1. And when we start looking at 4 or more ACEs, numbers like 4 or more ACEs make you 7 times more likely to become an alcoholic and 12 times more likely to attempt or commit suicide. And at the top of the pyramid there, you see this concept of early death. And someone who's experienced 6 or more ACEs compared to someone who has had 0 is upwards of 20 years average lifespan decrease. So it really starts to become a public health issue. And that's where we're kind of operating from. You know, how do we stop and disrupt this sort of multi-generational transmission of trauma? And as it relates to the teaching experience in our educational systems, I believe on the next slide, is sort of the awareness that we deal with. When I work with schools and teachers across the nation, one of the major stressors is about the lives these children lead that are outside of the school, and how can we help? And there are things we can do, which I will end on a high note, but really it's the awareness and understanding that children have impeccable reasons for behaving exactly as they do. And I think we're being called to make a shift in our systems about how we're representing and stewarding these young kiddos through what they have going on through their lives. And functionally, it's really a sort of shift from more of a behavioristic lens to a more humanistic. We talk about that sometimes those children's externalized behaviors are really a function of the trauma. And so it's not so much helping make them compliant, but rather addressing their needs such that we can alleviate and mitigate the traumas that they have, so they can see this school as a safe space. And That's actually pretty easily done in certain ways. If we go to the next slide, we talk about these key principles of trauma-informed approach. So how are you making your school safe? You know, and these are big kind of systems questions, cultural questions for you to look at, but each classroom really needs to be a microcosm of the school climate that you hope to create as a whole. And safety being first. Kids who are operating with trauma in their lives, trauma is the first factor in creating safety. So hypervigilance in kiddos, especially a kindergartner, we see them showing up, and maybe this is the first time that they're in a context like this, and they're seeking safety first in order to show up and be learning ready. So all these dimensions that you see listed here are about how the adults in the building can create these dimensions in order to have the preconditions met for the academics that we sort of are front-facing charged with. And the teachers themselves need to be those models. I think Lisa Ann sort of referenced it about teacher modeling and the importance of creating those safe and nurturing relationships. Because the stress hormones that are associated with the trauma in the child's lives, it's really the caring and protective relationships that buffer and mitigate the effects of trauma. And, you know, you might have seen it, there's a functional MRI picture right now of a mother kissing a child, and what happens in the brain is transformative in the sense that oxytocin gets released. It interrupts the biological stress response and protects the cells at a cellular level from what's going on. And if you change to the next slide, it's this idea of resilience and really everyone in the building being that caring adult. Because despite the trauma and one's ACE score, we're really starting to get curious about those that succeed and how resilience is a dimension of their story. And it always gets tracked back to that caring adult. Second dimension being high expectations messaging. So the question is, how are you and a group of educators telling these kids that you believe in them, they can, and they will achieve success? And then ultimately, we forget the students also need to participate in this process. So they themselves making a meaningful contribution. And then finally, how are showing up, you know, the adult lens, and we're working on an open educational resource to really do an adult-centric version of response and resilience for them to model. And we call them sort of these ordinary superpowers. Despite all things, you know, your love, your care, and mindfulness, training and modeling for them to help them regulate their stress responses, activate their parasympathetic nervous system, is essential in disrupting kind of all that we see and the starting point about how it shows up on our campuses. And I'll just leave you with this little nugget. Dr. Leah Waters talks about the strength switch. And it says, you know, we mistakenly believe that we can make our kids optimistic and resilient by weeding out all their weakness. But the strength-based science shows us the opposite is true. It tells us to turn the bulk of our attention to expanding their strengths. So in the context of ACEs and what we can do to help these kiddos is give them those concrete strength-based resources by helping them identify their own assets and modeling the response to stressful situations. Thank you, and I turn it back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Brian. That was very interesting. I know that I personally have enjoyed learning more about ACEs, and it helps me understand as a former educator. So on to the next, we'll hear from our last presenter, which is Community Partnerships with Kim Williams.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad I could be here with you today and talk a bit about community partnerships. We've heard a lot of really good things that are happening for young people to support their mental health through social emotional learning today so far. And we know that safe and caring and well-managed learning environments are really critical components of supporting young people. But learning environments are not really the only place that we want to promote mental health and support their social emotional learning. And so we're going to take a few minutes today just to consider how we can coordinate our social emotional learning efforts and mental health work with community initiatives and within the overall context of youth prevention work. And you'll see here on the screen right now that, you know, from a prevention perspective, we really want to attempt to you kind of move ourselves outside of our silos and think about it from a perspective of working together, because we know that the more that we coordinate what we're doing within our communities, the stronger outcomes that we can see for the kids in our community. So from a prevention perspective, when we're first looking at things, we really want to know as much as possible about our community. We want to know about the demographics. We want to know you know, how we can coordinate different strategies to meet the needs that we have for students. And so, you know, we've heard lots of different things about how we can support youth, but we kind of need to know really what's happening in our community before we can focus in on specifically, you know, what it is that we want to do in our communities. And so by doing that, we want to start off with a quick definition of what is a community needs assessment. And what that really is something that identifies the strengths and the resources that are available in the community that help to meet the needs of the children and youth and families. And the assessment really focuses on the capabilities of the community, including, you know, the citizens, the agencies, the organizations, the funding that are available within that community. So we want to know, like, what are the risk factors, what are the protective factors for the youth that we serve, and we want to build a plan to support youth from a variety of different perspectives. You know, as the old adage goes, it takes a village. And so it's not just that we want to focus on the educational perspective, but we also want to look at other areas. So in order to find current community needs assessments, where might you look to find some of those? County government is a place. You can review the data about your community. Perhaps the State Office for Child Welfare. A lot of times in communities, the United Way or other similar community foundations and funders, they have a really solid picture of community demographics and services that are provided, and, you know, where there are gaps in services. And then also there can be local prevention coalitions. Those are coalitions that are brought together. They bring together a variety of entities such as schools and nonprofits and youth serving organizations and governments and funders that bring them all together. And sometimes those types of organizations will also do some sort of community needs assessment. So you don't necessarily have to go out and do your own community need assessment, but start to look within your community to find out where you might get that type of information. And then the next question that we would need to consider would be, you know, who should be at the table when we're looking at this community needs assessment and thinking about how we're going to support youth social, emotional, and mental health needs. As I mentioned, education entities are important, but there's lots of different youth serving organizations like the Boys and Girls Clubs, Big Brothers Big Sisters, there's YMCAs, there's school districts, there's a lot of different nonprofit organizations, some that are focused on supporting social emotional learning and some that might not be, but those are really great people to bring to the table. You also want to think about who within your community might be possible funders. So local civic organizations, maybe like the Rotary or the Lions Club, maybe again, those local community prevention collaboratives, because those people can be great people to help support funding initiatives and grant applications. United Way, a lot of times local communities might have foundations, but there are also state and national foundations that are focuses on youth. So kind of bringing those people into the conversation as well as government entities. Sometimes there is a tax base that helps to support youth programming, and sometimes some of that funding can be used to support social emotional learning as well. And so, and then the last group that we want to bring to the table when we're thinking about bringing people together to support mental health and SEL for youth are those people that can help us evaluate and research what we're doing. So we want to think about it from all of those different aspects. The third question that I would ask you when we think about community initiatives and how we can kind of get out of our silos and bring this work together is to think about then what are the programs that are available that are going to meet the specific needs of our community. So we'll want to go back to our community assessment, identify where we already have resources in place, what stakeholders are meeting those needs, look into what types of programs and tools show the most solid evidence to accomplish what we want to accomplish. Is there an evidence-based program that's being used in a school that we could also use at an out-of-school time organization to provide a continuum of mental health and social emotional learning support for those students? For youth who have more intense needs, can we build relationships with those people and coordinate, again, what we're doing within the school system and the out-of-school time organizations? And so really starting to understand and know what programs there are that will meet those needs, and beginning to develop a plan for our work. Then, as I segued into, how do we create a plan for ongoing programming? This is where it can take a more long-term vision than just a short-term, what are we doing this year? We want to think about it from a longer-term perspective. And so we want to, we know what resources we have, we know what gaps we've identified, and we also have now kind of identified what programs we are. And so now we need to create a plan for, who's going to be taking on what responsibilities, how can we perhaps jointly apply for funding if there's a government funding source, perhaps a school district is an available fundee for that program, and so perhaps they can apply for that in conjunction with maybe a community collaborative group that also serves youth. And so bringing our people together and coordinating them in that way. Also knowing what our priorities are. So when we know what types of programs we need, we're then going to need to look for funding sources, and where do we want to start? Are we going to start with universal social emotional learning programming in schools and out-of-school times organizations? Or did we find that our need is really around focusing on more intensive needs, and we need to look for funding for more intensive intervention types of programming from a social emotional learning and mental health perspective? But really having a variety of places and partners in place so that you can find ways to weave your work into different eligible funding sources, and then also thinking about it from a sustainability perspective of, once we get those programs in place and once we're trained, then how are we going to keep that ongoing? I believe someone mentioned a bit earlier about the idea of ongoing professional development. How do we train people so we have people within our organization and community that are going to be able to continue to help train new people as we come on board? So there's lots of different factors to think about when we create that plan for ongoing programming. And then last but not least, as we're doing all of those things, we know that continuous quality improvement is really important. And if we've already identified through our community assessment how some of the data is collected, we then want to create a coordinated plan for measuring outcomes. We might need to have agreements to share data. Plans for collecting and communicating data can be a really large task. But we want to think about it from a perspective of, if we're collecting data in perhaps an educational environment, is there a way that we can use that data to show impact in a community perspective? And so thinking about what steps we need to take to put all of those things into place, and really thinking about it from a systematic and intentional way. So by thinking about it from both a short-term and a long-term perspective for the outcomes that we want to have based on what we've identified as our priorities, it can really be a huge benefit to a community to kind of link arms with each other and set ourselves up for long-term success. I know this has been a really quick overview and review of collaborative work for social emotional learning and mental health. So I would really just encourage you that you kind of take away from this and think about where else there might be people in your community that are doing similar work, and think about how we can kind of reduce the amount of silo work that we're doing in our communities to build and support social emotional learning and mental health for our young people, and how we can bring ourselves together to work as a community from a long-term perspective.
Great, thank you so much, Kim. So I guess we will go ahead and start in with a few of our questions. The first question that I have, I want to direct that to Lisa Ann. Someone asked, can you please specify what data the DESSA system consists of and what specifically is being collected? Lisa Ann. It looks like Lisa Ann might be answering someone else's question at this moment. So we'll go ahead and start. Oh,
Megan, I would be happy to answer the question.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Appreciate it.
No problem. So when we're collecting DESSA data, initially we encourage people to do a screen, which we call universal screen of the students or the young people that they work with, and that collects data around their overall social emotional competence. So it kind of gives us just a general impression from that initial screen as to whether or not a student has strength in their social emotional competence, if they're typical in their social emotional competence, or if they have an area of need for instruction. And then from that perspective, those students who have a need for instruction, we then have a more in-depth DESSA assessment, which will collect data around 8 specific social emotional competencies, and then also an overall social emotional score. And from that data, then we can create and implement plans that specifically target which social emotional competencies a student has areas where they have a need for instruction in, and also use the strengths that they have and the areas where they're typical to leverage and build those plans so that we can have strong outcomes with them.
Great, thank you, Kim. I know that Lisa Ann was having some technical difficulties. Lisa Ann, would you like to try that again?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Yes, and I also wanted to just mention, that the DESSA system itself, it does include that screening component and the in-depth assessment, and then of course all of the additional resources that can support the instruction at that point in time, whether it's from our curriculum providers or whether, there are other research-based and practice-informed strategies in there. And I think more specifically, one of the reasons why the DESSA items and the data that comes from that have been able to support so many organizations who, look at SEL and resilience through, Project Aware or through ACEs or through a trauma-informed lens is that, a lot of these items were pulled and developed based on resiliency theory coming from the Devereux Center for Resilient Children, so that they do build protective factors. So we're not just looking at data that tells us student perceptions, et cetera, which is more the survey side of SEL and climate, but we are looking at instructional skills that we can teach that will help build that resilience and protective factors. And, we don't know what children come in with. And so every child is different and no trauma is the same, and the impact on their skills may not be the same. And so, that really gives us an opportunity to use that strength-based data and understand their strengths, but really hit on those protective skills.
Great, thank you. We also have another question that came in while Gina was presenting. So Gina, if you would like to answer this question, feel free to, but I also know that this could be a question for Sherry and Kathy as well. The question is, were there any parent or community pushback or resistance to implementing an SEL screening tool? And if there was, how did you address that?
Well, I can let you know what Barnstable did. So we're treating our DESSA screening just like we do our academic screening, and we do not get consent for it. So it's not like we ask for a passive consent to do the screening. But with that said, we've shared results with families and we've had no pushback at all.
Yeah, this is Sherry. Just to piggyback on that, We had a lot of conversation with members prior to doing their universal screen. They were on board with this development in our schools, and we've even sat down, we sat down and had those data conversations with families. We also have had allowed them a screening tool for their child, so we could have those comparisons and really kind of get into those questions. So families have been really open to it. They've been excited about it. Some of the comments we've gotten is like, yes, this is what we need in our buildings. So it's been really positive up to this point.
Great, thank you. And then we also have a lot of questions about curriculum, specifically, you know, once you identify students, and also about NTSS, once you identify students with your universal screener, what types of tier 2 and tier 3 interventions are being used as far as additional assessments or you know, a lot of people have been mentioning second step curriculum. So that can also be a question for Gina or Kathy or Sherry.
Hi, this is Kathy from Town. So I can speak to that. Some of the, I had mentioned our district social emotional learning library, and it came exactly from that. To identify students that need tier 2 instruction, you need to then therefore have a curriculum, an evidence-based curriculum to meet that instructional needs. And because we're really mirroring our academic SRBI or multi-tiered systems of support, we wanted to make it evidence-based and curriculum-based, that it doesn't, it's not counseling, right? They're working with social emotional learning interventionists on a curriculum in the same way if you were to identify a reading challenge, you would be working with evidence-based curricula in a model. Some of the curriculum that we use is Second Step. We also used a company out of California, which is called Sanford Harmony. And that was actually donated from a benefactor, and there is evidence-based to it. And it was provided to our district for free. We also use a significant amount of social thinking curriculum. Girl and Boy Circle, that's also, it's called One Circle curriculum out of California. We've also used a lot of the Search Institute's work in regards to developmental assets, strengths-based model, really tied in nicely to the strengths base, and also materials from DESSA itself and from Castle is where we're really building not only a curriculum library, but an online sources library. Those are some of our more, we do it in tier 1 that we'll do classes, but also the interventionist would pull out students and do tier 2 interventions with those curricula. And then some other district-wide initiatives are really yoga for classrooms and mindfulness at the tier 1 level as well. Another thing I wanted to mention is through a partnership with Yale in Connecticut, we're doing ruler training is a tier 1, and that's our common social emotional language. It stands for recognizing, understanding, labeling, expressing, and regulating emotion. It's the work of Dr. Mark from Yale, the Center for Emotional Intelligence, and using that and systematically training our entire school system with that. It's kind of similar to a PBIS character trait model, but it's emotional intelligence. Right. So rather than each school building having its kind of own set of character traits, we're all using the ruler language, and part of that is a mood meter. So identify mood is imagine your best self, taking a meta moment to break, and then using emotional regulation strategies. So we're using that common language as well.
The really great thing about that piece too is we've been given permission to really use the first year of the ruler rollout to assist our staff with understanding the tools that a ruler provides and really getting familiar with them and taking a look at some of their own SEL before we go ahead and roll it out to all of our students. So that's a nice thing to have for our staff.
Say that piece, that staff self-care piece has really encouraged buy-in.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. We do actually have, have one question about the teacher resilience part, and I was hoping that Kim or Lisa Ann might be able to touch this. We had a question from Howard. A couple of the presenters mentioned the emotional resilience of educators themselves. And he said, we need to be mindful of our own emotional resilience. I'm interested to hear from any presenters about any experiences they have had in training administrators, teachers, coaches, to specifically support their social and emotional development. And also, Brian, if you want to chime in on this as well, you're welcome to.
Well, great. Happy to do so. I think one of the dimensions that show up in the field, I was just working with a district yesterday, as we start to think about it and this vision that we have for students, a lot of states are mandating SEL standards increasingly. And if we're looking at a student group of tomorrow that's caring and empathetic, question becomes, how do educators model that and be that today for these kids? Because that's how the students learn. And it's really sort of pushing the boundaries about what is or is not the role of an educator, you know? And so I think we're on the front end of the growth curve of the teaching profession as a whole, and sort of expanding that into human development. Work with some groups that really see some of the working conditions, the parent groups and the adults in the community, as part of a working condition issue. So we talk about, you have to have the skills to teach the skills themselves. And the profession itself is so heart-centric that when you're doing the work, we talk about as sort of oxygen mask, right? You have to take care of yourself first in order to meet the needs of these wonderful little humans that walk through the door every day. So just sort of having that empathy for self during the process and doing the good work that's done every day, but it's not easy. And just having forgiveness for self and taking care of oneself to show up every day.
Great, thank you so much. And that is actually right at 4 o'clock. So we're gonna have to cut ourselves off. We know that everybody has places they have to be and things they have to finish before the end of the day. So thank you again so much, everyone who joined us. And if your question was not answered, please know that we will try our best to answer your question via email, or we'll be able to follow up with you. So with that, I want to thank all of our presenters so much for being on the presentation today, and we'll let you get back to your day. Have a wonderful day, everyone.